All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon links are in the description and the top end comment if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So, in light of another one of its members leaving just a few weeks ago, we will be taking a look at the slow disintegration of OPEC as it has been unfolding for the last dozen or 15 years or so, picking up speed as we go. OPEC is a group of nations by the acronym Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, comprising mostly major oil producers, with a few exceptions like Gabon, for example. Group's largest, most influential, and effectively controlling member is Saudi Arabia, a subject that will come up repeatedly. The organization was formed decades ago by predominantly countries that have, or in many cases had, in the past tense, vast deposits of oil that's enabled them to effectively maintain plateaus of production at particular levels of their choice. Saudi Arabia, for example, over recent decades, most typically has maintained 10 million barrels per day for the most part, and for the majority of the group's history, up until the declines of the last decade or so, most of the group's members were large producers that had the ability to either curtail or expand their production numbers to varying degrees, obviously depending on the size of each individual member's reserves, thus putting the group as a whole in a position where it could hold a particular sway over the global supply-demand balance, and thusly, primarily, from that, a decent level of control over oil prices. The basic idea being to reduce either supply deficits or oversupply in the market, to push prices either up or down, keep them in sort of a preferred bumper lane, preventing oil prices from lunging too high to the point that they crash the global economy, and also preventing oil prices from collapsing too low to the point where the oil industry worldwide would otherwise end up with a significant lack of free capital, and thus further oil and gas exploration would stagnate. So, OPEC, as of right now, looks like this. However, you may remember, if you go back to the 2000s, it actually looked like this until the late 2000s, after which it looked like this. Indonesia was the first to leave, the primary reason of which, because they were no longer a major oil producer, they were no longer a oil exporter. After all, the title is Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And while Indonesia was able to maintain a plateau of 1.5 million barrels per day for several decades, they inevitably entered a terminal decline and eventually crossed the point where they were consuming more than they were producing. Then when you go into the 2010s, the peninsula nation in the middle of the Persian Gulf eventually left. We've been through many spats, many political fights with Saudi Arabia, one of which they were in the middle of when they suddenly decided to leave the organization. And for the last number of years before that, Qatar had also been sort of disobeying the rules, as within OPEC, even outside of any supply cuts or oversupply orders, most of the members have output level quotas that they're not supposed to exceed or fall too far below. And Qatar kind of wanted to actually produce what it was capable of. Granted, they won't be able to hold these levels for that long, but they wanted to produce up around 1.5, or in this case, now down to 1.3 million barrels per day, whereas within OPEC, they were supposed to stay around or below 800,000. So, with a myriad of issues coming together, they decided they were out. Ecuador left soon after them, having a growing domestic oil consumption level that had, at that point, already reached about half of their oil production levels, and wanting to maintain as wide of a shrinking export ratio as they could, which didn't exactly vibe with the new reality of OPEC, which has been Saudi Arabia constantly ordering and maintaining production cuts across the group. So they left, and now, for similar reasons, Angola has just left. Angola, not one of the Persian Gulf nations, nor Libya, and thus not having gargantuan petroleum reserves it can dial up and down the output levels of at free will. Angola climbed up to an ultimate production peak, like a normal oil producing country, and has since been on their terminal decline slope and are down around 1.1. And in their case, they were actually getting in verbal trouble with the group because the 1.1 that they're currently able to maintain is below what the group was wanting them to maintain, at least up until they implemented these new super extra production cuts, in which Angola would now be required to cut its production below the 1.1 million barrels per day that it is struggling to keep itself up at. It kind of wants to keep maintaining 1.1 million barrels per day, or at least as high of a production level as it can, because it's a developing country, it's a rising economy, so they kind of want money. Angola decided that's the new reality within the group of constant, eternal production cuts just wasn't for them, so they left. Now, the question arises, is that the end of it? No. Most likely, there are going to be at least two more departures in the near enough future. I would say probably within the next 10 years. The first one, and the most likely, is going to be Iraq, because Iraq has quite a lot of petroleum remaining, and the country itself has actually not been entirely explored, and actually could, if they had gone through the measures to, if they had been quote unquote allowed to by OPEC, by Saudi Arabia, they could have gone all the way up to between 6 and 7 million barrels per day. They could be there by around right now, as they were heading up towards 5 million barrels per day. And they were told to stop around 4.5 or so, and they did. They obeyed, they listened, but as the years went by, they increasingly grew tired of it, and especially as oil prices recovered over the later 2010s, and then post-COVID, they recovered to even higher points, and then soared into triple digits for a year or so. Iraq really would have preferred to have been up at the 7 million barrels per day that they are capable of, instead of the 4.5 during the 2010s that they were told to stop at, and the even lower flat 4 million barrels per day that Saudi Arabia ordered them to stay at post-COVID. The hints of Iraq leaving are already there, as they've started disobeying the orders. First, during some of the deeper production cuts, they were supposed to go down to and hold at about 3.5 million barrels per day. However, once oil prices had marginally recovered, Iraq went right back up to about 4 million barrels per day really fast before they were supposed to. And the current orders for them were for them to hold at a flat 4 million barrels per day, as I said. However, they've repeatedly gone up to 4.2 and then dropped back down, and most recently went up to 4.3 again until these new, most recent orders, which ordered them to cut 200,000 barrels per day extra from 4 million down to 3.8. And Iraq is now playing the I did do what you said game by cutting 200,000 barrels per day, but cutting it from the 4.3 that they had raised themselves up to against the rules. So they've cut from 4.3 down to 4.1 instead of from 4 down to 3.8, as Saudi Arabia actually wanted them to. So the giveaways, the tells are pretty blatantly there that Iraq is getting pretty fed up with this. So they are very likely to head on their own way sometime in, I would say, the next 10 years. But there is one other. There is also the UAE. The UAE was normally maintaining, in most recent times, a plateau of about 3 million barrels per day. However, they still do have quite a bit of petroleum remaining and are actually capable of maintaining higher levels fairly easily, a 4 million barrel per day plateau. And just before the COVID demand collapse and the harsh production cuts that obviously followed that, they actually did jump up to a 4 million barrel per day plateau. They just only got to hold that plateau for about 2 months before COVID happened, and they had raised themselves back up to between 3.2 and 3.3. But then there were new production cuts, and those saw them go down to 2.9 and hold at 2.9 for the last year or more. And then they just got permission again to go up to 3.2. However, then Saudi Arabia called for these new extra production cuts, under which the UAE's permission to go up to 3.2 is obviously canceled, and they're instead supposed to cut back by another 200,000 barrels per day. However, at least as of the most recent data, They have not budged, not in full 100% disobedience, only like 95%. They didn't raise their production. However, they have not yet been lowering it like they're supposed to. So the tells are starting to build up on the UAE's end as well, that they're probably going to want out at some point. Beyond that, though, among the other shrinking number of members, I could not say anything with any strong amount of confidence. Anyways, that's the end of this one. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. There are also links in the description to various Google Docs with all kinds of different graphs, data compilations, visualizations, and write-ups covering everything from energy to metals and mining, demographic data. All of it's there to look at 24/7. It's free. And a link to my catch channel, of course, will be in the top pinned comment. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.